And welcome everybody. We're going to get started with single sign-on and ClicData. I hope everybody can hear me correctly. With me, I have Srinevi. And again, I hope everybody can hear me. Audio, checking, everything is okay. As always, you can ask questions throughout the webinar. Sri will help moderate the chat. And you'll also be sent a recording of this webinar at the end of the day or by the end of tomorrow. As well, you can react on Twitter, and again, you can visit our page at support www.clicdata.com support to check past webinars. So I don't see any red flags here. My audio seems to be okay. My video seems to be okay. So I'm going to keep going. On today's agenda, we're talking about ClicData and SSO. Specifically, we're going to talk about OKTA. We are going to talk about how we improve the security with single sign-on. What is single sign-on? Configuring ClicData to work with a single sign-on provider, identity provider. We're going to get into that. And also a couple of case scenarios which may be of interest. So obviously the biggest question is, hold on a second, you guys are ClicData. You're not a security identity provider specialist. What are you guys talking about single sign-on for? Well, we're doing this because we do have quite a few customers that ask us how we can integrate with other security platforms. And we thought of making a webinar, thinking that we can definitely add to it. Now, obviously we are not security specialists, but we're going to do our best to explain how we integrate with single sign-on. But just a quick few words about ClicData. If you are new to ClicData, we are a data management and BI platform. We have a bunch of connectors to a bunch of different data sources, systems, databases, etc. Some of these are smart connectors that know how to handle the data, pull that data into a data warehouse that we also offer for you, included in your subscription, hosted on Microsoft Azure. And with our application, you can also do data flows, data management, and create dashboards, alerts, and a lot of other things. And you can automate all that stuff, resulting in a lot of savings in terms of the time you spent building these things out and sharing it either internally or externally, but also faster implementation. Again, just 3 quick benefits. We do offer that instant data warehouse and data lake. We just added a new feature recently to add non-structured documents to your account. We have connectors for over 250 systems and databases. And again, like I said, some of these are intelligent and smart connectors that know how to handle the API and the data and structure the data properly. You can also create all kinds of different dashboards. The editor is up to you. The style, the look and feel, it's all you. Nothing to do with us. And finally, you have this automation and accessibility, as I mentioned before, as well as accessing this from pretty much any device. So with that said, and a quick introduction to ClicData, let's get into single sign-on. So like I said, we are not security specialists. We don't know all the different types of security and identity management that exist out there. We do know a few, and of course our engineering team and our operations team does know enough to build, obviously, integration with other systems. But again, what is it exactly, and why are we talking about it? What is the reason why we even have a webinar? The way I kind of picture single sign-on is a little bit like, you get into a venue like a big event or forum, and you get different color bands on your wrist to identify what you've paid for, in a sense. And then all you have to do is go from booth to booth or store to store and just show your bracelet. And basically, based on that, immediately they know who you are. They know potentially your age, and therefore whether you can have an alcoholic drink or whether you've paid for that service, etc. So it's a very quick way that you've identified yourself once at the entrance of the venue. You got yourself kind of stamped with a little token, in this case, a little bracelet. And after that, all you have to do is show that bracelet around. Nobody really knows your name, your user, your age, etc. But the color kind of defines what you can and cannot do. And that is basically single sign-on. ClicData, when is connected to a centralized identity management, does not really know your username and your password. That is managed by somebody else. but that somebody else has told us that it's okay, you can access ClicData, right? So you've been authenticated against that, what we call an identity provider or an IDP. That is basically the SSO concept. And what its benefits are, again, like I mentioned in my venue or forum example, is the fact that, the thing that gets passed around is the bracelet, or in the case of technology, the token. So we don't really have the username and password being kicked around between systems. As I said, ClicData does not know who you are. ClicData knows the color of your bracelet or the token, but it's enough for it to know that you can access certain thing. So it basically makes it a lot more secure. It also allows to centralize this. So if you're a large company, you have a lot of users, a lot of passwords kicking around and usernames and systems. By having a centralized identity provider, it makes it so much easier to enforce password policies, to monitor access, and so forth. As well, for the user, it makes it easier because they only have to remember one password, right? They memorize that username and that password, and that allows them or not access to different systems. So single sign-on is quite important for those reasons. Now, who are these identity providers that I keep talking about? Well, there's quite a few of them. In fact, there's some applications and platforms out there that are not only applications, but they also provide identity. As these systems become so large that many different people start using them, especially cloud systems, then people start seeing a benefit of saying, well, since we're all on, let's say, Salesforce, why not use that as our centralized management system? Or if we're all on Office 365, can we authenticate against Office 365 as opposed to other systems? There's also some old technology kicking around, Active Directory, you may have heard, or LDAP as well. Those things still exist, especially with larger corporations where they have their own authentication identity provider database installed on premise, and some of them are moving to the cloud and so forth. So a lot of different combinations. It gets very technical, very fast, and very complex. And there are some that are kind of weird. They're not really business, but you can still do identity provider like Facebook and Twitter. And probably you have done that as well, where for a personal point of view, you just keep your Google password and you sign into different systems using your Google identity rather than creating an identity on each system that you sign up for. Now, the one that we do a lot of testing with, and we are actually partners with, is OKTA. We've also have a partnership with OneLogin, of course, but OKTA has advanced quite a bit, and recently they also have purchased or acquired or merged somehow Auth0, which was also a very popular platform for authentication. So now OKTA and Auth0 are actually the same entity, although they keep still separate systems, I believe. But OKTA is quite complete in its offering of identity provision and security and so forth. And there's another reason why we kind of like them, which we'll get into that a little bit later on. With that said, I'm just making sure that just checking here, all good. Checking my questions, make sure there's no. If there's any questions at this point in time, if you're not sure about the basics of this would be this is the point in time that would be good to ask a question before I move on and start getting into the details. So what are the details? Well, let's talk about ClicData. ClicData is not an identity provision or provider system, okay? We do not offer that service to other people. If you do not connect ClicData to an identity provider, we keep your username and credentials in our own databases. They're encrypted. They're managed by ClicData in Microsoft Azure, but that is it. I mean, you get a login screen, as you see on the screen. You get your email, your password. We're going to the database, all encrypted, and validate the credentials and say, yes, this person can log in or not. That is it. That is basically how the security kind of works if you don't have anything else. But what happens if you are on a single sign-on? So the user opens a browser and types, let's say, acme.clicdata.com. Well, that comes to our servers, and we kind of say, well, Acme, this company Acme that has this domain, actually does not want to use our own security, our ClicData security. They want to use an identity provider security. So we're going to say, okay, well, fine. I'm not going to even pop up the screen of asking the username and password. I'm actually going to redirect immediately to the identity provider. So you'll see a screen that looks a bit like this, which is during the time that we're actually sending you over to the identity provider. Let's say OKTA in this case. It could have been Office 365. It could have been any other system. Now, if you're not already logged in, you will get presented with this login screen. And this is your one username and your one password that you will need to put in to actually authenticate. Now, notice here that ClicData, you're outside of ClicData at this point in time. You're not in ClicData anymore. That means whatever you type here, ClicData has no knowledge of. So you're actually sitting on their screen, on their login, on their platform. If you were already logged in, you would still be redirected there, but they would remember, oh, you've been logged in already. So either way, you will come back to ClicData, and they will tell us, yeah, this user can log in on your system there, and it's okay. You can proceed. They got the right username and password. It's all good. And immediately we get logged you in. So you notice that we did not ask for username and password at all. We communicate simply by redirecting, and it's their security, and then they just give us a token that we'll continue to use to communicate between us that has nothing to do with your username and password. Okay? So that is basically the basics of it. This is the summary of what I just said, is ClicData does not store your user's password. Moreover, you or your users can use the same username and password for other systems. And also, we no longer control the security policies, okay? What are those security policies? Well, security policies are, for example, your password must be at least 6 characters, or it must be a combination of numbers and letters and symbols, or it can't be the same one that you've used over 3 months, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all managed by your identity provider. And it will be on that screen that you will be asked to say, well, now you can't use this password, or your password has expired, et cetera. It has nothing to do with ClicData. All these policies are now managed by the identity provider, okay? And you'll see that on our screen, the password policies will be disabled. That screen will be disabled. Am I going too fast, slow? I hope not. Hope everybody is getting this. All right. So at this point, you can say, Telmo, this is really simple. How hard can this be? And is that it? Is that all you have to do? Well, unfortunately, no. This is where history and technology and vendors come into play, and everybody's fighting for their technology. Apple versus Windows, the usual stuff, right? So we have a couple things here: the standards or protocols of communication. So for ClicData to say, hey, identity provider, here's this user, can you give me authentication for this user? And then for the identity provider, again, to provide information back to us, there's a communication that takes place. And there's a standard or a protocol of communication so that we understand each other. And just like any other language, there's syntax and there's formatting, and there's a ton of different standards, as always. Now, back in the days, security assertion markup language, or SAML, was the big one. It's a heavier protocol. It's a little bit older, but that also means it's more established. It's more prevalent in a lot of systems, okay? The new one called OpenID Connect, or OIDC, is lighter, it's newer, and it's a lot more appropriate for today's standards of SaaS and open or cloud and so forth. Nonetheless, both of them are very valid. Now, there may be others out there, but I would say these two are primarily the only ones that prevail across many systems. And other than, and we'll talk about LDAP and Active Directory at some point in time, other than those other two, these two are the only ones that we as ClicData support. Okay. Now, you don't need to know specifically the format and the standard of this, or the internals of these protocols, but you need to know at least what systems or what your identity provider can support or not. Okay, so basically, it's it's important to know at least the terminology SAML or OpenID to know where to go from next. All right, so let's talk about OKTA a little bit. Like I said, OKTA is kind of one of our preferred ones, mostly because, again, we partner up with them to test a lot of our code and to make sure that they support OpenID, they support SAML, they support a variety of different configurations. But again, you could do this with a lot of other identity providers. We just feel that OKTA has got a very complete solution out there. And we're not being sponsored or anything by them. We're not getting paid more for this, but we do like it, and it obviously supports some of the use cases that our customers use. So this is not a real life demo. It's more like, let me show you what it is to be OpenID. Let me show you what SAML looks like, and let me show you how to set those up in different configurations. So I'm just going to open my browser here. And I hope you can see my browser. Sri, just let me know if something is not good, but hopefully it is.
Yeah, all good.
Excellent. So let's talk about OKTA first of all. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically show you how it looks going into ClicData. So this is a demo account that we have, a development account that we have. But basically, there's a couple of things here that are of importance. The first thing is your directory of users, of people, right? This is kind of, again, as we mentioned before, it's an identity provider. So it needs to store the list of identities. Now, with OKTA, what is interesting is you could use OKTA as your directory, but we'll talk about a case scenario where you actually have the directory of all your people somewhere else, but you want to use OKTA as a go-between. It's a more intrinsic and more complex case to set up, but it still is possible. But in the case where you just want to centralize your users, you can come here and say, listen, I'd like to add Telmo, I'd like to add Nico, etc. You just add people to it. And then just like anything else, you have a first name, last name, the username, that is the login name. That must be an email in this case, and a few other things that you can set. Another thing I'm going to show you here is the concept that these profiles, and when I click add person, you notice that the list is quite simple. You can add people to groups and so forth. But there's this custom field here, can sign in. Now, this is a custom field that I added myself. When we look at my profile and in its entirety, I'm going to click profile. You see there's a lot of different properties. You can really create a full organization directory, like with any other Active Directory and so forth. Employee numbers, manager ID, you can create relationships, etc. So this could be your company directory. But you can also add custom properties. So here I added two, a can sign in and a team. Now the can sign in fact, a better name for it, in our case, it makes sense because we only have ClicData, but you could actually have properties to say can sign in into Salesforce, can sign into ClicData, can sign in into different systems. So you can set up those properties. That's one way to do it. It's not the only way. And you can also put in teams here. In this case, this is ClicData team. So you can actually populate the team name. And when you log in using OKTA, you will actually assign that user to that team automatically in ClicData, not in OKTA. In fact, OKTA does not know what this team is. To it, it's just a name or a property for this person. So that's the first thing. The second thing is applications. Now, what you see here, for example, is that I have created two different applications. Now, typically in OKTA or any identity provider, you also need to say, okay, what applications can this user sign into or see or have access to? And typically you would see a lot of different applications in here. Now, in our case, we only have ClicData, but as you notice, I have ClicData OpenID and ClicData SAML, right? And the reason why I wanted to have both is I wanted to show you the configuration of both and to show you the different settings you will have in each one of them. Now, again, you create the applications down here, which I'll show you next. And then you come here and you say, well, let me assign some applications, right? And, you can have as many applications created, and you can basically just assign it to this user or potentially to groups of user, which makes it easier to manage once again. So again, there's this concept of basically you have an identity provider, a directory of people, and then you're saying they can access this, they can access that, etc., etc. So let's talk about the applications. Now, there's a lot of different applications you can. Okta itself is partnered up with, literally hundreds of applications. So, you may have Salesforce and Office 365 and a couple of other things in your company, and you can centralize all your security in Okta and have Okta basically do the login for all your users into these different ones. Obviously, one of them is ClicData. We also are listed there. So in my case, I've also set up two different ClicData applications, one again called OpenID and one called SAML. So let's just take a look at the SAML application first. And I'm going to go back to the general, and I really don't want to get into all of this stuff, but I feel you guys spend time coming into the webinar, so let's dive into at least a few of the properties that I feel are important. As you can see, there's a lot of stuff.
Would be great if you just zoom in a little bit so that we could also read.
Absolutely, thank you. Let me know if that's better.
Yeah, that is much better. Thanks.
Excellent. Yeah. So while I'm doing this, in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to log in to ClicData on the SAML portion. Now, what you're going to see here is you're going to see, hopefully, a redirection. And you saw a little sign in to SML. So it did not ask me for username and password. And the reason why is because I was already logged into Okta here. So he knew who I was. He didn't even ask me for a password. But he did call Okta and said, can this person log in? And Okta said yes, and I was able to log in. So what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to look at the settings of single sign-on our side. And again, I'm going to zoom in a bit. And this is why SAML is considered a heavy protocol and a more difficult protocol to put in place. As you can see, there's a lot of information, okay? The thing to retain from this, if anything, is the fact that we need two things. Okta needs some information from us, and we need some information from Okta. That's basically how the thing works. So one of the things we do here is we give you the information that you need to import into Okta. And you can download this. It's a file. And on that file, you'll have all this information plus a bit more that you can actually import into Okta. And from Okta, you can also do the same thing and click the import identity provider metadata, and it will populate all this stuff for you, including this gibberish, which is a certificate. And by the way, because SAML is an older protocol, there are different ways to turn it off, certain options, and there's a lot of, compatibility things. And there's a lot of different switches that, frankly, only a security expert or somebody that's an expert in single sign-on could explain to you. And our support team may be able to help you to a certain level. But in a sense, you can see right off the bat that there's a bit of heavy lifting here to do. Some of them are quite self-explanatory. So, for example, force auth, that forces users to go through the login page, even if they're already logged in. So in my case, if I enabled that, you would have taken me to Okta's login page, but not log me in automatically. It would ask me again to log in, okay? These things as well are very one-to-one with the properties that I have in Okta. So what we're asking here is could you please tell me what the email, which is the unique value of identifying a user, is on your identity provider? Again, remember, we don't know we're talking to OKTA here. We've imported their metadata, but this could be anything, right? So different identity providers may call email differently, right? They could say email with a dash, they could say email lowercase, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of different ways to put these fields together. And again, here's that team name as well, and so forth. And you can even add user parameters, right? So the process of validating this is, once you do this, you download this metadata, you import it here into the OKTA side, and from the OKTA side you export it and you import it here, and then you need to do the validation. This would have changed to click here to validate. You validate, it will test using your username that you're currently logged in, and if all is well, if all is set up, configured properly, then it basically says, okay, I can talk to this identity provider. And after that, once you click save, all your users are going to be using SAML and going to this identity provider. So if they're not there, then they cannot log in. And this brings us to a very important thing, which is applicable to whether it's SAML or OpenID, which is one account in ClicData is one identity provider. We cannot have a ClicData kind of guess, where do I go, before I ask them for their username at least. So this is why you'll see a lot of identity providers. And I'll give you an example here. For example, if I go to our account on Office 365, what is the first thing that it asks me? Well, in this case, it didn't ask me because it actually remembered me, is it asked me for my username. So when it asks me to sign into another account, it first asks me for my username. So it knows to which identity provider it needs to go in to validate your password. Now, we don't do that at ClicData. We either ask for username and password in one go, or we redirect the entire, all users on that account. If your account is acme.clicdata.com, all Acme users are going to be authenticated against the one identity provider, okay? So that was the first, that was a very important point in terms of the way we've implemented single sign-on. Now, let's talk about the other application, the other protocol, which is OpenID. And I want you guys to see the difference between the simplicity of it. I'm going to zoom back out again because, again, you see a lot of stuff here, but most of it is just read-only. It's not input. You don't need really, the only two things you need is client ID and client secret. And likewise, I'm going to log into my OpenID account. Again, if all works well, it goes to ClicData. It says, this domain is on OKTA. He logged me in using OpenID. Okay, it was kind of, that's what he did. So let's look at its settings here on single sign-on. It states OpenID. That's the other option here, other than SAML. And you see the screen is so much simpler, right? You get a couple things to set up here, right? You have our information here. Likewise, the process continues to be the same. We need to provide something to the identity provider, and the identity provider needs to give us something, right? So I'm just going to delete that in case somebody reads my screen quickly and copies my client ID or client secret. But in essence, basically, all you need is to copy the client ID, the client secret, exactly what they provided us here with, and you're pretty much done. There's a scope thing, OpenID profile. This is very standard. In fact, we tell you what you need. We leave this as an open field in case you have a very special installation of OpenID. But in fact, all we need is access to your profile and to your email. That's what we're asking here for permission for scope. And it is fairly straightforward. We need to know where to go, the client ID and the secret. And boom, we do the same thing. We validate, and if all goes well. So if you take anything from this webinar, is the fact that use OpenID at all points in time. That is probably the best thing you can do. and it is compatible with so many more systems these days. It is definitely the cloud standard to use these days. So with that said, these are the two different ways we can do it. Now, I don't know if there was, we have a question here. Not sure if it's moderated. Do you know which method Google uses? Is that it? Sorry.
Yeah, we have a few questions, Thelma. So the first one is, yes, do you know if people could use Google as an authentication method, I guess, or the question is more about what method does Google use?
Absolutely. So Google definitely supports SAML as their first one into their Google Cloud. That is kind of their baseline. But I do believe that they also support Google OIDC on Google Cloud. So they actually support both of them, in fact. And you can set them up using Google Identity as a provider.
Thank you, Thelma. The second question is, apart from OpenID and SAML method, someone is asking also about LDAP. It seems like LDAP is also a supported method on ClicData. And how does that work? If you could just talk briefly about it.
Absolutely, yeah. So again, if SAML is old, Active Directory and LDAP is even older than those two. And Active Directory, as I said, it was something that it's even though there's now an Azure AD, it is a Microsoft, 100% Microsoft developed thing. But Active Directory just by itself is an on-premise directory provider. It does more than identity provider, by the way. It does a lot of other stuff. Active Directory was kind of the backbone for Windows networking, and it still is in many companies. LDAP, it's a lightweight directory. It was actually more on the Unix side. It was something that came through universities and through the Unix side, and LDAP is also used. Interesting enough, Active Directory actually adopted LDAP, so Active Directory can actually serve as an LDAP identity provider as well. Now, Active Directory and LDAP is not something that is typically over the web authentication. It's not something that you do. There's too much, the protocol is very heavy, and there's too much sensitive information inside of it that it was meant just for internal networks. And as such, is not ideal for cloud connectivity, and you'll rarely see any open cloud system offering that. But if you're using if you have your own on-premise Active Directory or LDAP server or both, you can use our data loader to install on your network, and we will do the same thing. But instead of going to an identity provider to ask for your username and password, we're actually going to ping the data loader and say, "Hey, data loader, can you poke around inside your network and tell me if this user is allowed to log in or not?" And very similar to an identity provider, our data loader will also double as a identity provider and kind of say, yes, he can, or no, she can't, and so forth. So basically, Active Directory and LDAP is also supported. It is, like I said, for on-premise, and we're seeing it less and less as people are moving to things such as Azure Active Directory, which is kind of the cloud version of Active Directory, especially with work from home and a lot of these new things happening. On-premise directory, at least security checking, is not as prevalent anymore, but we do support it.
Okay. Thanks, Thelma. And actually, you did raise another point that I wanted to get into. Is one of the users is asking, how do we support single sign-on with Office 365? It's become a norm nowadays for people to use that every now and then. So if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely, yeah. So I definitely want to. So I myself use Office 365. Now what you're going to see here is yet another ClicData account. And you'll see ClicData comes in and it says, you need to go somewhere else. In this case, it goes to Office 365. Now, don't let the cool background blue ClicData logo fool you. We're actually on Office 365. You can see here we're on Microsoft Online. It's just that we've tailored our Office 365 account to, to basically, show this screen. So then, again, I log in and I sign into this account. And now Microsoft says, yeah, this person can log in. And again, just like any other thing, we're logged in. Now, how did we do that? Basically, I'm actually using OpenID on this account, and it is fairly straightforward. Not sure. I'm up. Sorry. I'm going to go to account settings, single sign-on. I'm always concerned about showing, here, not that people can type all those codes so quickly, but nonetheless, this is actually my OpenID. So nonetheless, it's OpenID. It's very straightforward. You're going to get, once you, when you go to Office 365 and you say, I'd like to create an OpenID application, very similar to OKTA. They have a menu where you can create an app, and the app can be SAML, can be OpenID, etc. The same exact way. So the same way, they're going to give you a client ID, a client secret, and again, in this case, they just ask you for profile and OpenID. That's the scope, and boom, you're done. All you have to do is type in those those three fields here, and your account is now tied into Office 365. Unfortunately, I cannot show you our Office 365. I don't have the admin access to do it, but it's the application is created once, and then you just have to say which users can access or not ClicData, and it's fairly straightforward.
Okay. And I think, Thelmo, if a new user is signing up on ClicData, then they could directly use Office 365 as well as a sign-in approach, rather than setting the single sign-on, right?
Absolutely. So that's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up. I'm going to go to the sign up here, sign up for free trial here. When you do this, sign in with Microsoft, we actually set that up for you automatically. So if you have a Microsoft Office 365 account, we actually set your account to work with OpenID automatically. You don't need to do anything, and we'll do everything behind the scenes for you. So you don't even need to know that client ID and client secret. Absolutely. Thank you for reminding me of that. Sometimes I forget how many features we have.
That's good, Dave. I'm going to probably ask one more question before we move on again. In terms of OpenID, is it also possible for people using OpenID to map fields such as emails, first name, last names, and team parameters?
Interesting enough, no. So that's a great point, and a difference between what we did with SAML and what we did with OpenID. With OpenID, the new standards of OpenID basically state that if you assign somebody via your identity provider to that application, you're basically saying, I'm giving authorization for this person to access this application. Otherwise, I would have never added this application in the first place. We were not able to do that with SAML for a variety of reasons. And as such, we needed that can sign in flag. If you remember, the can sign in flag is here, and you need to define this. And that's because SAML, again, being an older standard, has been kind of brutalized to a certain extent that everybody does all kinds of different things with it. And as such, we needed this mapping to be provided by the person responsible for the SAML. Whereas with OpenID, it's so much more standard. We know what the field email is. We know what the first name. We know the last name. And in fact, we go even beyond just doing this. With OpenID, we basically can just create the account on ClicData. Whereas with SAML, we actually, the first login, we create the account for them. So the way the accounts are created on ClicData are substantially different. And that's, again, because it's a more modern, OpenID is a much more modern protocol that relies on the fact that A, I've given you permission on the identity provider to access this application, and B, I'm controlling your security by creating the user here first and assigning you the team and assigning you the properties and so forth. And so it is less heavy on the identity provider side to know all the features that, for example, ClicData has to offer. Things such as which teams do they belong to, which parameters do they have, what is their license, what is their role, what is their menu, etc., etc., etc. So this is all defined here. If the identity provider tells us, yes, Telmo Silva can log into this account, and he comes back to us and says, oh, hold on a second, but Telmo Silva does not have an account here, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to say, sorry, we don't have enough information to log you in. So you have to tell somebody to create your account on ClicData. Now, with SAML, sorry, I'm actually on the SAML account. But with SAML, we actually create because somebody went in and said, can sign in. That means that we actually create the account automatically for them here. But we create them, and you will see this if I go to the SAML account. We ask you a lot more questions because we need to know, well, what is the default role for the users? Do they have any parameters? Do they have any team, etc.? So all these things we create at the time of creation of this user on ClicData. Whereas with OpenID, if the user is not created, the user cannot log in. So those are two important differences as well on the way we do things, in fact, right? And we feel the OpenID way is much better because, to have all these parameters here on the identity provider is a very large duplication of effort for some people. It may be more centralized, but as we add more features, it's always difficult to also make sure that people will update their identity provider with those properties. Did that make sense?
Thanks, yeah, I think it does make sense in terms of what you can set on SAML and what you cannot on OpenID. So
I don't know. Yeah.
Those are the questions for now. I know we have a few other questions, but just to keep the webinar in line, maybe if you have anything else, Thelmo, you could move on to that one.
No, yeah. So I want to talk about one last scenario, which may or may not be important, but we've had a few customers of ours to say, well, you know how I was saying before that, one ClicData account, one identity provider. Well, sometimes our customers actually use their ClicData account to support their own customers, okay? And their own customers have their own identity providers. So we may have, let's say that the main user of the account is, let's say, this first company here, which uses Google as an identity provider. But then they have two clients, company here and company name there, and one uses Office 365 and the other one Office Salesforce. So now this is still one account, one ClicData account. So how can the owner of ClicData kind of offer this to their customers in such a way that they don't have to manage usernames and passwords for their own customers, but they let the customers themselves handle that? Well, with OpenID, because it's now the master account that creates the users, they can control and say, well, I'm going to let user so-and-so, who's one of my customers, and they're using Office 365, I will let them log into ClicData. I'll create their user profile and so forth. But how do I set up their single sign-on? How do I say, hey, ClicData, go check Google for us, but go check Office 365 for this user, and go check Salesforce for this other user? Well, as I said, we cannot do that. We only check against one. So this is where systems such as OKTA and what I call federated authentication come into place. With OKTA, and again, there are others, including themselves Office 365 and Google and OneLogin, what you can actually do is centralize all that into OKTA. Now, what I mean by that is that you're not going to add the usernames of your customers into OKTA in this case, or your own, by the way. What you're going to do is use OKTA as a broker between ClicData and all these systems. And you're going to let OKTA figure it out, which one I need to go to validate if this user is correct or not. Now, I'm not a security expert, but in OKTA, there's an entire section on this. And again, I call it federated authentication because, in fact, it's not OKTA doing the authentication. It's federating to other identity providers. But from a ClicData standpoint, all we care is that OKTA will do the translation and the communication for us and tell us, ultimately, can this user log in or not? And again, you could set up OKTA against Google with SAML, OKTA against Google with OpenID, OKTA against Office 365, again, with both protocols and more, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it will take care of making sure it goes to the right identity provider and kind of feedback to that. And that you can centralize your security, at least for your side, it's kind of taken, and your customers get the benefit. Now, this is a more complex scenario to implement, but highly doable with OKTA. And of course, you would need to purchase OKTA or a subscription with OKTA as well for these type of setup and configuration. So I just wanted to talk about that case scenario because there are customers that do ask us for this, and this is how you do. Again, we're using OKTA as an example, not as the final, as the only solution that can do that, right? So before we get to any other questions, if there are any other questions, in summary, I just going through the benefits and use case for single sign-on. I hope that was apparent that single sign-on can facilitate with a little bit of technical work at the beginning and configuration. It's fairly straightforward. That the SSO process using either OpenID or SAML, OpenID being a much lighter weight and a much easier way of configuring, is fairly straightforward. The fact that we don't actually store anything, it's really the identity provider that will store the usernames and passwords, and OKTA can be one of those. Configuring ClicData and OKTA, again, our support teams are always willing to help as much as we can help within the framework of what we can do. And again, we talked a little bit about the special case of federated authentication, which is, again, a multi-IDP scenario. And with that, I know I've answered quite a few questions. I don't know if there are any other questions, Sri?
Yeah, there's one more question. Probably we could answer that. In terms of customers or clients who are trying to use ClicData's dashboard as embedded dashboards within their portal, how does single sign-on help them? Or if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great point. So our live links and of dashboards work exactly the same way as signing into the application. So if you, again, if you have an application, let's say Salesforce, and you embed one of our dashboards inside of Salesforce, and your authentication is with Salesforce, your single sign-on is with Salesforce, because they're already logged into Salesforce to see the dashboard and to do other activities, we're not going to ask them for the password again, because as soon as the live link appears or is requested, we're going to do the same process very quickly and say, oh, he's already logged in to Salesforce, therefore I'm just going to show the dashboard live link. So live links will obey the single sign-on process unless they're in public mode, okay, or password protected mode, okay, which are less secure ways of securing your dashboards, of course. But if you do have a dashboard live link which is in public, we will disregard single sign-on because your wish is to make that dashboard public. So obviously we're not going to force your viewers of that dashboard to log in. In essence, any embedded dashboard will follow the same thing as the application. Will try to get itself authenticated. If you are authenticated, then the dashboard will appear as it is embedded or not. If you are not authenticated, then it will redirect you to the login page of whatever identity provider you've set up to get itself authenticated and find out if you can see that dashboard or not.
Okay, thanks. And I think using single sign-on for such cases, especially OEM partners that we have, I think it helps them to create a really seamless experience for their end users, because they're logging into one portal and you can have secure dashboards, pass parameters to the dashboard so that they're filtered for every user who's logged in, and the user doesn't have to know at all from where the dashboard is populating. It's one system for them. So single sign-on is greatly beneficial for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think those are the questions for now. Thank you so much, Thelmo. It was really great. It's a difficult topic and a very technical topic to cover, but I hope this was helpful for everyone.
And we did it in 15 minutes. So, you cannot learn everything about SSO in 15 minutes. So, we did our best. But if you have any questions, just, again, visit our website, www.clicdata.com, support webinars. There will be the replay of this, as well as other items. With that, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Sri, for moderating this chat and for bringing your expertise as well. And have a great week, everyone. Take care.